Welcome to Reddit Stories from Jing. We're here to discuss about a greedy pastor, some journalists that lost their integrity, and other stories. Here's a story by Zero Penguin Party. Better check your facts because people know people. Had to post this one. It isn't petty, it isn't regular, and it ruined a guy's journalistic career. The internet has evolved quite a lot over the years. Some people may remember Usenet groups. I know I do. I used to have a lot of fun reading them. Kind of similar in a way to today's Reddit in a way, no matter what the subject was. Someone would have a Usenet group for it. But unlike today's Reddit, it was strictly text. You could download images, but they would take forever to download and could often be across several different messages. Just one of the messages missing, and you wouldn't get the image. Things then improved, download speeds slowly got faster, and then there was IRC that came about. IRC saw the same thing. There was chat room for anything and everything. And if there wasn't, you could clearly create it. If you were to try to watch a video over the internet back then, it could take you a couple of hours to download the music video. You get the idea. This is important for the context of the story. I was a writer on a couple of wrestling newsletters during the mid to late 90s. We only published our newsletters online. You could have it emailed to you or go to a website to read it. Think we hosted on GeoCities or Tripod. Both wrestling newsletters were independent of each other, and I used different nicknames on each. One was more a review and preview newsletter, where we would post reviews of the most recent shows or events, talk about current feuds, and talk about what we may think will happen in the next big event. The other newsletter was a news and rumors newsletter, with a few fun puzzles or competitions thrown in to keep things interesting. At the time, you had a few big name wrestling news and rumor sites and a handful of small ones. I was a writer on one of the small ones. Sometimes we would get news and rumors from the big name websites, giving them credit where appropriate. Sometimes we would hear things from people in the business. Everyone had their sources of information. And sometimes we would make an educated guess on possible scenarios based on current trends in the industry. It did get a bit cutthroat at times with some newsletters claiming that they broke the news first when it had already been published in other newsletters first. And you could even have some newsletters devote all of their time trying to rubbish the other newsletters for publishing false and misleading information. It was rumors. We did not always get it right. Through a couple of readers on my first wrestling newsletter, I learned a huge surprise in the works for one organization, which could potentially lead to something happening at a big event coming up. I won't mention the surprise, but it involved a person from another sport. No other wrestling newsletter had reported it, so I included it as a rumor on the second wrestling newsletter. I was instantly rubbished by one of the major wrestling newsletters at the time publishing a clearly nonsense rumor that would never happen, only for that very same newsletter to publish the exact same rumor 2 or 3 days later and claim to be the first ones to publish it. This sort of stuff happened all the time. It did not bother me at all. Anyway, I happen to have a few wrestlers who actually read my first newsletter. No big names as such, but a couple of lesser known wrestlers in the big organizations. I knew who they were, but refused to reveal their identities back then and refused to reveal them now. One of them let me know of an unknown fact from a major match a couple of years earlier. It was to do with an injury that happened during a part of the match. This fact had never been published anywhere else at the time. I mentioned that I wrote for another wrestling newsletter that dealt with news and rumors and asked if I could repeat the information. The wrestler said sure, but not to credit him. So I go ahead and publish the rumor. Straight away, I had another of the smaller wrestling newsletters say that it was nonsense. They said it was impossible for the match to have continued. injury happened. They then started a smear campaign on the second newsletter. I was getting spam emails constantly, virus attempts originating from the competition. The competition even went so far as claiming that they had the full story of my wife of 10 years working as a hooker. Don't ask, they were trying to find anything to smear me with. There was more sinister and disgusting stuff, but I won't write it here. Why it got so personal, I do not know. But the funny thing was that at the time, I was the 22-year-old single university student, and if I had a wife of 10 years who was working as a hooker, I would have had to marry her when I was 12. But his smear campaign was working. Our readership dropped by nearly 50%. It was time to get some revenge, although I had no idea just how far the revenge would end up reaching. Firstly, I approached one of the bigger wrestling newsletters. They would often run ads at the bottom or rear of their newsletters for affiliated newsletters. I organized a new affiliation with them, removing an affiliation they had with the competition. Small potatoes. I started promoting the second newsletter heavily on Usenet in some of the wrestling groups, which ultimately led to an increase in our email subscription base greater than what it was before his smear campaign. This negated any effect that his smear campaign had, but I was hungry for more. I wanted to show it where the sun don't shine, so I contacted those wrestlers who read my first newsletter. I explained the situation to them, and they were happy to help out. It took a couple of weeks, but eventually I was able to post a link to a 15-second video hosted on a GeoCities webpage, as well as on a Wrestling Usenet group, where the wrestler at the center of the injury rumor not only confirmed it, but gave a shout out to my second newsletter. While it validated me and my information, it still didn't shut the other guy up. Finally, a break. While the guy used an alias for his newsletter, he did actually mention his name a couple of times and where in the US he attended university. Using this information, I was able to get a friend in the US to do some researching for me, attended that same university, and discovered that the guy had actually completed a journalism degree several years earlier. Further research indicated that he was now working as a reporter for a regional newspaper in the US. His wrestling newsletter must just be a hobby, so I decided to send all of the information I had, his smear campaign, etc., to the newspaper office. I don't know what, if anything, it would do, but it was worth a shot. About a month later, I got an email back from the newspaper thanking me for the information. They discovered that he was using the newspaper system to run the wrestling newsletter, which was against their policy, so they fired him. And because the newsletter or the newspaper was part of a chain of regional newspapers across the US, he was going to struggle to find another journalism job. The newsletter got shut down as well, because without the newspaper system to run it, the guy had no way of continuing with the newsletter. Side note, I ended up finishing with my newsletters not long after anyway. The first newsletter, as I was just a writer for it, I finished with it when the owner of the newsletter decided to close it down. He didn't have the time to devote to it due to work commitments. The second one, I started off as just a writer slash contributor, then took over the competitions, then eventually took over the whole newsletter. Original owner didn't want to do it anymore. But in the end, I was finishing up at university. I had to move on with my career, so I closed it down. That was rather an interesting way to end a journalist's career who tried to take down his competition by doing a smear campaign, only for that smear campaign to blow back on his face. Well, maybe not exactly those words, but you get what I mean. Jackass manager gets his comeuppance shared by ambulance driver 2 off Reddit. Entirely too many years ago, I started to work at a fast food company. Let's call it Southern State Not Baked Poultry. Southern State Not Baked Poultry wasn't a bad first job. I was 16, and the assistant manager at that location was my best friend's stepdad. So we took what was tedious and menial and tried to make it fun. He was actually a really good manager and genuinely cared about the people who worked for him. He would do silly stuff before the store opened while we were doing prep. He would have music playing loudly from his office as long as everything got done and done well. He really didn't care if we had fun doing it. We'll call him Larry. This story is not about him, though. The story is about our store manager. We'll call him Tim. Tim was the exact opposite of our assistant manager. Everything had to be taken seriously. Fun was outlawed. I genuinely hated working with Tim. Tim was an egocentric, power hungry, petty little man with delusions of grandeur because he was a manager for Southern State Not Baked Poultry. Tim's approach to managing was to work the employee until they burned out. When they did, fire them and hire someone else. Needless to say, morale when Tim worked was in the garbage. Tim hated that crews would prefer working with Larry instead of him. He hated that crews had fun when Larry was working. He hated that our store's numbers were always better when Larry worked. Mostly, he just hated everyone. But one thing that he absolutely hated was a silly little thing Larry did. If it was before the restaurant opened, he would stick his tongue between his teeth and lower lip and shout a hi to whichever employee just walked in. It sounded absolutely ridiculous. I would always do the same thing back, which ended up sounding like hi, Wowie. A perfect example of what an ass Tim was is this. There was a young woman who, due to a variety of stressors, attempted to commit suicide after a particularly grueling shift working with Tim. After she had recovered, she came back for her last paycheck, and Larry was working. Not a coincidence. She called the store to find out what day he was working. So Larry sat her down out in the lobby, bought her lunch, brought her last check out, and sat and talked with her for about an hour. It was after the lunch rush, and he had the time. So he made sure she was doing okay now, talked about whatever she wanted to talk about. By the time she left, she was smiling, but had tears on her cheeks. She had never had someone just sit and listen and let her talk out everything that was going on. Well, the next day, Tim had come in and hauled Larry into the office. His words, and I can quote them exactly because the office was a tiny little cube with no ceiling, just a place to stash paperwork and a computer were. The next time the suicide queen comes in, tell her to do it right next time. So now you have a clear picture of exactly how petty and vindictive this little man was. Here's where the revenge starts. We were scheduled to have the regional and national bigwigs for Southern State Not Baked Poultry come through our area for an annual inspection. Tim had his eyes set on being one of those bigwigs, at least for the region. Why wouldn't he be? He did everything by the book. That automatically made him a good manager, at least in his eyes. Everything had a checklist and a procedure and a set of written instructions in the book. And if you couldn't meet the expectations set forth in the book, well, Tim will yell at you and berate you. Because that's how a manager manages, you see. Well, before the bigwigs got to our store, we knew what day they would be coming. Several of us had agreed that on the day they came through, we would all screw up just enough to get Tim to blow his cool. Because the regional manager and the national bigwigs all believed that Southern State Not Baked Poultry was a family company and that employees were valuable team members. The day in question arrived, and the bigwigs were there for their big tour. Whoops, one of the fryers hadn't had the oil replaced last night. Oh, look, the shaker table hadn't been cleaned. Darn it, we've got way too much coleslaw made up, and we won't get it through before we have to toss it. Crap, we don't have enough poultry in the cooker to fulfill the lunch rush. Man, someone forgot to preheat the second cooker. You get the picture. After the second time, I took a minute too long to get the basket of poultry into the cooker. Tim absolutely lost his yelling, cursing, throwing things. He actually physically pushed me away from the breading station in the middle of the lunch rush, while the regional manager and several bigwigs from the national stood there. While we had a line several people deep at both cash registers and a lobby full of people eating. Tim stood there, gulping like a fish. His mouth was moving like he was trying to say something, but no words were coming out. The room was absolutely quiet other than the beeping of a fryer that was done. I looked at Tim. This was the moment we had all been gearing up for. I looked down at where he had pushed me, a set of handprints of flour on my chest, and I cut loose on him, yelled at him that I quit, took off my apron and threw it at him. Told him I was tired of his abuse, of his poor management, of how he single handedly drove morale through the floor every time he walked through the doors, how he was a crappy excuse for a manager, and that if he didn't have Larry and a couple of good shift leads, he'd have driven the location out of business a long time ago. All the color drained from his face, and he bolted to the office cube. The national and regional folks ended up comping everyone's meals that were in the restaurant. Interestingly enough, Tim was not fired, but he was demoted to assistant manager. Larry was promoted to manager. About 10 years later, I was working my current job as an EMT. We had just dropped a patient off at the hospital that was across the street from the same restaurant, and my partner was hungry. So we drove across the street and pulled in. Now, I hadn't set foot in that restaurant since the day I had quit. But lo and behold, who was working the counter but Tim himself? And his name tag still shows assistant manager. The restaurant was empty since it was between lunch and dinner time, and I just couldn't help myself. I stuck my tongue between my teeth and lower lip, and as loud as I could, shouted out, "Ice cream!" Had been back there since. But that was around 12 years ago. I'm willing to bet he's still just the assistant manager there. Here's the thing, people. Never berate your employees, especially if you're in the food business, because you're inviting lawsuits. Once something goes wrong with the food, just a reminder. Okay, here we go. My grandmother put greedy preachers in their places twice, even after she died. TLDR, which means too long didn't read. My grandmother generously served her Bible believing Christian church for almost 50 years without asking anything in return. But when she became elderly, disabled, and homebound, her church acted like she did not exist until she was in hospice care and literally on her deathbed, when that church showed a sudden interest in telling Grandma to remember church in your will. She waited until exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right audience, to expose these greedy assholes for what they are twice. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative, Bible believing church for her entire adult life. This church, well, I'll call it Big White Church, was a member of a large evangelical denomination. Big White Church was located in a prosperous suburb of a large city in the Bible Belt of the deep south of the USA. Grandma was very active in Big White Church. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church retreats and choir tours, taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights, and was very active in supporting home missions as well as helping with other youth programs. She always tithed and often gave extra for missions and special offerings. Grandma's greatest talent was making other people feel important. I've seen this firsthand many times. Although I belonged to a different church, I often visited with Grandma, and when I did, I usually went to Big White Church functions with her. I've seen her single handedly cook breakfast for dozens of Big White Church youth, a task which took over 2 hours, even in the church's large kitchen. Then, after the meal, she asked the group for a round of applause for the high school student leader for doing such a great job of organizing the prayer breakfast. I remember that on a big white church youth retreat at a rural church camp, she drove most of the night to go back to the city and retrieve a big box of evangelistic materials that one of the assistant pastors, whom I'll call as pastor, had forgotten and asked her to get in time for a morning program the next day. His boss, the senior pastor, I'll call him pompous as pastor, never found out that as pastor had screwed up or that grandma had fixed it for him. As pastor never even thanked grandma. Even though I was a child, this bothered me so much that I asked her about it. She said that she didn't mind at all. She told me her reward would be that those materials would help children find Jesus. Grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73 when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound and could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. Her mind was just as sharp as ever, and her faith remained sincere, but her body wore out a little more every day. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to her church, its leadership, and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home, etc., without success. Every one of these invitations was declined or simply ignored. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor, pompous pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit her so they could plan her memorial service, which she and grandpa wanted to be held at the church. Pompous pastor was too busy, but as pastor stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, here's what happened at that meeting, with my grandma literally on her deathbed. Grandma, Grandpa, and as pastor discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes. Then as pastor started pressuring her to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Grandpa told him firmly that this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They went back to discussing the funeral for a few minutes. Then, as pastor steered the conversation back to Grandma's will, with liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to Grandma about her will or the church's financial needs because she was terminally ill and in an enormous amount of physical pain. As pastor would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but would then go back to talking about the church's financial needs, heavenly rewards, where your treasure is your heart will be also. Matthew chapter 6 verse 21, Luke chapter 12 verse 34, etc. My grandma started crying. To put this into context, Grandma was more than a steel magnolia. She was titanium coated with diamond wrapped in Kevlar. She rarely ever cried and never ever cried about herself. Not one tear. When the doctor told her that her back was broken so badly that she would never walk again, nor during the following 6 months in futile rehab. She would shed sincere but well managed tears at funerals and while visiting family members in the hospital when they received bad news. She would cry to console others, weep with those who weep, but nobody, not grandpa, not her daughter, my mom, nor any of my uncles or grandma's siblings, ever remembered her crying for herself. My grandma was sobbing uncontrollably. Grandpa, a retired steelworker, former Marine sergeant, and Korean War combat veteran, physically grabbed as pastor and escorted him out of their house, not too gently. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived another 6 months, mostly because of sheer force of will. Eventually, though, Grandma passed away and we held her memorial service at the funeral home, not Big White Church. Pompous pastor and ass pastor were conspicuously absent. In fact, there were no professional Christians from Big White Church at the service at all, not even in the audience. To start the service, Grandpa stood up at the podium in front of the crowd and said, "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited Pompous pastor and asked pastor from this funeral service. This service is not an appropriate place for me to give you my reasons for doing this, although you all know me, and so you know that my reasons are good ones. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them." To start the service, Grandpa stood up and on front of the podium and said, "Yes, I already read this. My bad." So there. There were about 100 people at the funeral service. At least a third of them eventually stepped up to the microphone. The service, which we had planned to last about 30 minutes, lasted for over 2 hours, and as best as I can tell, not one person left early. There was laughing, crying, and hugging. Three of her grandchildren played some of her favorite songs on the piano and guitar. We all joined hands and sang her favorite hymns. Afterwards, dozens of people told my grandpa that it was one of the most comforting and uplifting funerals they had ever attended. More than a few remarked that funerals are better without any preachers anyway, or something similar. Remembering her pastors and her church in her will, the 1-2 punch. A couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the bequests in Grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa dearly loved each other, they had separate wills because she told my mom that makes it easier for us to respect each other's turf, and because their lawyer had recommended it. Nobody thought that my grandparents were wealthy. They had lived in the same small but charming house in a prosperous, well maintained suburban neighborhood for the past 50 plus years and had worked hard and lived modestly. But it was rumored that they had a very nice nest egg. Of course, there was no legal requirement for anyone to attend the reading of the will or to even have a reading. Modern telecommunications and near universal literacy have made this quaint custom practically extinct. But the reading of the will was a tradition in our family because it was one of those events that gave our close knit extended family an excuse to get together. We never had family reunions. They were too difficult to schedule for our large family. But we got together at birthdays, holidays, funerals, baptisms, etc. So if you attended several of these, you would see just about every one of your cousins, aunts, uncles, and even great aunts and uncles who were grandmas and grandpa's siblings and in laws. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contained very personal bequests of items that had little cash value, but were the departed family members' way of telling their loved ones that they wanted to share a cherished memory with them one last time. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumor mill had been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by Grandpa, that Grandma's will contained some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included my mom, as well as aunts, great uncles, and many of the grandchildren. We were all surprised, however, to see pompous pastor and ass pastor from Big White Church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that Grandma's will had bequests not only for Big White Church, but also for them personally. Maybe it was just our imagination, but my siblings, cousins, and I couldn't help noticing that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over the good fortune at Grandma's generosity. Grandma had a large family, so a sizable number of beneficiaries were named in her will. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than an average middle class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in, every seat was filled, and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space for all of us. Grandma's lawyer suggested that Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor sit in chairs, which were in front of the room, next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, which meant that the lawyer and these two preachers are the only ones who were directly facing everyone else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, they did not notice, as all of the rest of us quickly noticed, that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch them closely, and practically impossible for them to leave the packed to more than overflowing room before the entire meeting was over, because they were farthest from the room's single door, and there were almost 2 dozen people standing or sitting between them and their only path to escape. The bequests were quite generous, but pretty much what we had expected. Grandpa kept their house, its contents, their retirement accounts, and everything that remained after all of the bequests have been satisfied. Children, grandchildren, and several local charities received nice, but not extravagant amounts of money. Several sentimental items were named and given to various friends and relatives. Grandpa was first beneficiary listed in the will, but after him, all of the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several $1,000s. Then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece, and nephew received a little more. Then several local nonprofits received very nice amounts, etc. Bequests to Big White Church, Pompous Pastor, and Ass Pastor were almost the last ones listed in the will. They listened politely to the other bequests, but with steadily growing anticipation, they noticed the exponential upward trend in Grandma's largesse. When Grandma's lawyer got to the Big White Church and the preacher's part of the will, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce these bequests to Big White Church, Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor, Miss Grandma's name, requested that I read the following statement to everyone present." He opened the letter that was written in Grandma's own handwriting. "For the past 10 years, not one person from Big White Church has ever called me, come to visit me, or sent me a note to tell me that they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not one of the church members who I worked with for all of those years, loved dearly and thought were my friends. I worked very hard for you when you needed me for many, many years. But when I needed you and your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit when I was dying, and I invited Pompous Pastor to come to my house and help me plan my funeral. This was my last attempt, after many attempts that I had made over the past 10 years, to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still loved dearly, even though they had made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church, maybe some of my church friends, whom I had not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they love to hear Pompous Pastor preach, so if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear him, even if they would not have come to see me. But Pompous Pastor couldn't find the time to visit me or even call me to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. As Pastor came by my house, but he didn't want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted to remember his church in my will. That's all. Just remember his church in my will. It was then that I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time, the very last time. As Pastor did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, 20% of my entire estate, for what was now my former church, Big White Church. This amount was name the amount enormous of money, generating muffled wows from many of her ears, including me. But I got to feeling badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor. So I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to Big White Church to match all of the love that they have showed to me during the last 10 years of my life when I was suffering and lonely and could no longer able to work my ass off for them for free like I had done for almost half a century. That is her entire written statement, the lawyer said. Now let's get back to the bequests in the will. Bequest to Ass Pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Pompous Pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. The pompous pastor and ass pastor sat there looking like someone had just injected a gallon of Novocaine on their jaws. Every one of Grandma's family and friends felt an overwhelming urge to laugh out loud, but we kept quiet because we knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't finished yet. Grandma was simply setting them up for a 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. There is one last bequest, the lawyer continued, for a charity called, which he named and I'll call it Black Charity. Then he paused before naming the amount. Most of us had no idea what Black Charity was, but by the looks on their faces, we could tell that Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor knew Black Charity very well. Their faces displayed the same expressions of shock, dread, and horror that they would have if the lawyer had said, "This bequest goes to the demonic baby eaters to buy extra large rotisserie barbecue grills and tons of charcoal." Every eye in the room was now fixated on Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor. The lawyer, who happened to be my uncle, one of Grandma's and Grandpa's sons, let the silence continue a few seconds more. If we had been able to read Pompous Pastors and Ass Pastors' minds, we would have known the history behind the looks on their faces. Black Charity was sponsored by a large black church with just a few miles from Big White Church. They ran a free food clothing bank, assistance programs for foster children, home delivery of pre-cooked meals for homebound seniors, legal aid, and other social services. A long time ago, Big White Church, which was and still is 100% Caucasian, had provided a few years of financial and other support to Black Charity. Then there was a very bitter, acrimonious breakup, allegedly because Black Charity was practicing the social gospel, while Big White Church was preaching the true gospel. Big White Church even sued to try to get some of their money back, although the suit was eventually settled and very little money actually changed hands. But this being the Deep South, everyone knew the real reason why Big White Church or any white church would stop supporting a black charity. Those N-words were getting a pity and not staying in their place. Grandma and Grandpa had seriously considered leaving Big White Church at that time, but they had reasoned that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance by their words and example. They knew they would never persuade everyone, but maybe they could reach some of the youth at their white church and break the generational cycle of racism. Grandma used to tell us, "My church is my mission field." We did not learn the true depth of her statement until after she died. Since then, Grandma and Grandpa had secretly sent a portion of their tithe to Black Charity every month. Most of Grandma's family, including me, didn't find out about any of this until after the meeting had ended. But Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor obviously understood what Grandma, by her actions, which are more powerful than words, was saying to them. If you had grown up as a white person in the Deep South, as Grandma, Grandpa, Pompous Pastor, and Ass Pastor had, you would understand. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racists, condemned their bigotry, and crushed their delusions of white superiority by saying, "These black human beings, whom you hate, disrespect, and have mistreated, are better people than you are. So they deserve my money more than you do." Having allowed time for everyone to observe pompous pastor and ass pastor while they thought about how their white church had treated this black charity and how they and their church had treated our grandma, the lawyer said, "The amount is..." Then he named the exact amount that grandma had named in her handwritten letter, the huge amount of money that would have gone to Big White Church if she had not changed her will. Hooray for grandma! May she find peace wherever she may be. So make sure not to keep any grudges and also live within your means, not get too greedy, and as they say, if you keep treasures on in heaven, then you would always be remembered. So she's the treasure that went up to heaven, and everyone is so thankful to have her. So that will be the end of my Reddit episode. Thank you for listening, everyone. So make sure to like, share, and subscribe this channel. I would be looking forward to more videos using Reddit. Thank you.